On March 19, 1945, at 7:05 a.m., the aircraft carrier USS Franklin was sailing just 80 kilometers off the coast of Japan when a single Yokosuka D-4 wide-duty bomber emerged from the low clouds, flying less than 30 meters high. The Japanese pilot did not need precise aim. The Franklin's deck was crowded with 31 aircraft fully fueled and armed with bombs and torpedoes, ready to take off in minutes. Two 250 kilograms bombs penetrated the flight deck. The first pierced directly into the hangar full of planes. The second detonated over dozens of aircraft carrying 130,000 liters of aviation fuel. The Franklin exploded into a 300-meter fireball. But what the Japanese did not know was that this ship had been ridiculed during its construction for a critical design flaw that everyone believed made it too vulnerable to survive combat. The USS Franklin had been designed in 1942 as part of the Essex class, the backbone of the American fleet in the Pacific. But during its construction at the Newport News shipyard, engineers discovered a devastating error. The hull compartmentation system had structural flaws that would allow water or fire to spread faster than on other aircraft carriers. Internal Navy reports indicated that the Franklin could sink with a third of the damage other ships could withstand. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, received the report and his response was direct: "Fix what you can and put that ship to sea. We need every available carrier." The Franklin was commissioned in January 1944 with its vulnerabilities known, and the crew soon discovered that the ship's unofficial nickname among other sailors was Big Ben. This wasn't out of affection, but because everyone expected it to sink like a broken clock in its first real battle. Now, at 7:06 a.m. on March 19, 1945, those predictions seemed to be catastrophically confirmed. Chain reactions of explosions tore the Franklin apart from the inside out. Mark 13 torpedoes detonated in the hangars. 5-inch HVAR rockets fired wildly in all directions. The steel of the deck melted at 1,500 degrees Celsius. Sailors were blown overboard by the force of the blasts. Others were instantly vaporized where they stood. Captain Leslie Garris was on the bridge when the first explosion occurred. He was thrown against a steel bulkhead but stood up bleeding and took command. All around him, the Franklin was dying. Of the 3,400 crew members, more than 800 died in the first 30 minutes. Another 487 were seriously injured. Most of the senior officers were dead or incapacitated. The internal communication system was destroyed. Damage control was impossible because the teams responsible had been annihilated. But Garris would not abandon his ship. He shouted to the men nearby, "This ship will not sink as long as I am alive." It was a statement that seemed delusional. The Franklin was 50 miles from Japan, surrounded by hostile waters, on fire from bow to stern, with continuous explosions tearing through its guts. All vital systems were failing. Electrical power had been cut. The firefighting systems were not working. The ship was dead in the water and beginning to list to starboard. At 7:30 a.m., the Franklin had a 13-degree list and was sinking by the stern. The carrier USS Bunker Hill approached for evacuation, and the order seemed obvious: abandon ship. But Father Joseph O'Callaghan, the Franklin's chaplain and a former professor of mathematics and physics at Holy Cross College, refused to leave the deck. He organized makeshift firefighting teams using wounded sailors and cooks who had never been trained for damage control. O'Callaghan had mentally calculated something critical. If the fire reached the aviation fuel tanks in the lower chambers, the Franklin would explode with a force equivalent to 500 tons of TNT. The shock wave would destroy not only the Franklin but also the Bunker Hill and all escort ships within an 800-meter radius. More than 8,000 men would die. The chaplain ran into the burning hangar and began throwing 500 kilograms bombs that had not yet exploded. He tossed them over the side of the ship, directly into the ocean. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Donald Gary, an engineering officer who had been thrown against a bulkhead and had 3 broken ribs, descended 6 levels below the deck through ladders covered in fire and bodies. He needed to reach the engine room and restore power to the water pumps. Without them, the Franklin would sink in less than an hour. Gary found 3 men alive in the engine room, unconscious from smoke inhalation. He dragged them one by one back to the deck, then went down again alone. With burned and bleeding hands, Gary managed to restart one of the auxiliary generators. Power partially returned. The water pumps began to work. But the fire continued to spread. At 8:15 a.m., a new series of explosions rocked the ship. The aviation gasoline tanks had finally ignited. A cloud of fire engulfed the entire flight deck. The Franklin was now listing 14 degrees and visibly sinking by the stern. All nearby ships retreated, waiting for the final explosion. But then something extraordinary happened. The cruiser USS Santa Fe, commanded by Captain Harold Fitz, ignored direct orders to keep its distance and approached the burning Franklin to within 15 meters. It was a suicidal maneuver. Any explosion on the Franklin would also destroy the Santa Fe. But Fitz knew there were hundreds of men alive on the Franklin who would die if they were not evacuated immediately. The Santa Fe pulled up against the hull of the burning carrier and began taking off survivors. In 50 minutes, the Santa Fe evacuated 832 men from the Franklin. Many of them jumped directly from one deck to the other while explosions continued. But Captain Garres and 704 men refused to abandon the ship. They continued to fight the fire. And it was at this moment that the Franklin's structural vulnerability, that very flaw everyone believed would doom it, paradoxically proved to be its salvation. The faulty compartmentation that allowed fire and water to spread also meant the ship did not have bulkheads that were too rigid. When explosions tore through a compartment, the energy dissipated laterally instead of concentrating and rupturing the hull. The Franklin was absorbing catastrophic damage but remained afloat because its more flexible structure distributed the impact. A more rigidly built ship would have snapped in half. At 10 a.m., the destroyer USS Hunt approached. It passed a tow line to the Franklin. With one of the generators working, the carrier managed some of its own propulsion. At only 3 knots of speed, the Franklin began to pull away from the Japanese coast. But the hell was far from over. Secondary explosions continued throughout the day. At 2 p.m., the remaining Mark 13 torpedoes detonated simultaneously, tearing a 12-meter hole in the hull. Seawater began to flood the lower compartments. The Franklin now listed 17 degrees to starboard. The stern was so low that the propellers were visible above the waterline. All calculations indicated the ship would sink before nightfall. But Father O'Callaghan and his makeshift teams continued fighting the fire with hand hoses, buckets, and even their own clothing soaked in seawater. In the engine room, Lieutenant Gary and his engineers worked for 18 hours straight without stopping, diverting power from destroyed systems to keep the pumps running. They could not eliminate all the incoming water, but they managed to slow the sinking. Every hour the Franklin remained afloat was one more hour of distance from Japan. Every mile traveled increased the chances of survival. During the night of March 19th to 20th, as the Franklin crawled through the ocean in flames, the Japanese Navy launched kamikaze attacks against the American fleet. 50 planes dived toward the Franklin. The carrier had no functional anti-aircraft defenses. All guns were destroyed or unmanned. The escort ships shot down 3 kamikazes, but 2 managed to get through. The first 0 hit the Franklin on the flight deck, detonating exactly where the fire had just been brought under control. The second dove straight for the bridge but was shot down less than 100 meters away by a single 20mm cannon manually operated by sailor Robert Blanchard, who had lost his left hand in the morning's explosions and fired by propping the weapon against his own chest. By 6 a.m. on March 20th, 23 hours after the initial attack, the Franklin was still afloat. The ship had traveled 90 kilometers. Damage control teams had contained the main fires. The list had been reduced to 12 degrees through careful counterbalancing of water in the tanks. But the Franklin continued to sink slowly. There were only a few hours left before the stern was completely submerged. It was then that the destroyer USS Miller approached with high-capacity pumps and began transferring pressurized water directly to the Franklin's pumps. With the additional pressure, the engineering teams finally managed to pump out more water than was coming in. For the first time in 24 hours, the Franklin stopped sinking. The list stabilized. The ship slowly began to right itself. During the next 5 days, the Franklin continued its agonizing journey toward Pearl Harbor, traveling 4,800 kilometers at less than 5 knots. The flight deck was twisted and melted. The hangar was a charred steel skeleton. 2/3 of the hull were flooded or destroyed. Smaller explosions continued to occur daily. But the Franklin did not sink. On March 24, 1945, 5 days after the attack, it entered Pearl Harbor. When sailors on shore saw the carrier, many could not believe it was still a ship. The Franklin looked like a floating carcass of twisted metal. But it was floating. And 704 men had survived because they refused to give up. Later analysis of the disaster revealed numbers that defied comprehension. The Franklin had suffered 832 dead, the greatest loss of life on any American ship that survived the war. The carrier had been hit by two 250 kilograms bombs, suffered more than 400 internal explosions, was hit by an additional kamikaze, and remained in firefighting combat for 30 continuous hours. The total destroyed area was equivalent to 85% of the ship. But the Franklin survived. And the reason was not just the courage of its crew, although that was fundamental. The technical reason lay in that same structural defect that everyone had condemned. The flexible compartmentation that was considered a vulnerability allowed the ship to absorb damage that would have split any other carrier in half. The Franklin had been saved by the very feature that should have condemned it. Father Joseph O'Callaghan received the Medal of Honor for his actions, becoming the only U.S. Navy chaplain to receive the decoration during World War II. Lieutenant Donald Gary also received the Medal of Honor for descending alone into the burning engine room 3 consecutive times. Captain Leslie Garris was decorated with the Navy Cross. Sailor Robert Blanchard received the Silver Star for shooting down a kamikaze using only one hand. The USS Franklin was towed to the New York Naval Shipyard. In April 1945, it arrived for full repairs. Naval engineers estimated that it would be necessary to rebuild practically the entire ship. The cost would be equivalent to building a completely new aircraft carrier. But the Navy decided to preserve the Franklin not as a warship, but as a testament. In August 1945, when the war ended, the Franklin was still under repair. The ship never saw combat again. In 1947, the USS Franklin was officially decommissioned and placed in reserve. For 17 years, it remained anchored in Bayonne, New Jersey, as a silent memorial. In 1964, it was finally scrapped. But its story had already become legend. The aircraft carrier that everyone said was easy to sink had survived the worst non-fatal disaster in American naval history. The lesson of the Franklin echoed through the following decades. Naval engineers revised their concepts of rigid versus flexible compartmentation. They discovered there was an accidental wisdom in the seemingly flawed design. Sometimes, the ability to absorb and distribute damage was more valuable than the ability to rigidly contain it. The defect had become a virtue under the extreme stress of real combat. Today, memorials in San Francisco, New York, and Arlington National Cemetery honor the 832 men who died on the Franklin and the 704 who survived the hell. The ship's bell is preserved in the Navy Museum in Washington. And the story of the carrier that refused to sink stands as a testament that sometimes the greatest triumphs come not from the perfection of design, but from the absolute refusal to accept defeat.